The Commonwealth Ombudsman released a report looking at 19 Australian agencies, such as the State Police Services, ICACs and the ACCC, and to see whether they're complying with laws around data access. Basically, when they're looking at people's private information, is it done in a fair and reasonable way? I got to tell you, the report is scathing about all the agencies. Our privacy is under constant attack by the forces of government. I've been concerned about that for a very long time. I think it's something that we take far too lightly in this country, and far too few politicians seem to know anything about it. One chap that does, though, is Gideon Rozner from the Institute of Public Affairs. Gideon, you've had a look at this report. What did you make of it?
Well, look, it didn't surprise me, Cory. I mean, this kind of stuff has been happening for years. I mean, for example, do you remember that train wreck of an interview with George Brandis explaining the Australian government's power over our metadata, data about what we're visiting on the internet, what internet addresses we're looking up and things like that? It turns out that after this was introduced and federal agencies were given access to this information, you had all manner of agencies that had no business accessing it and weren't even contemplating being able to access it, looking for it, including, for example, local councils trying to access our metadata to police things like tree removal and rubbish disposal. We saw in the Corona era, QR code information used to check into pubs and so on was misused by police and effectively accessed to investigate other crimes. The bottom line is, Cory, the government cannot be trusted to manage our data, to keep it secure, to access it responsibly, and frankly, to look after our best interests. The last 2 years have taught us that. Where once liberal democracies were, the role of the state in a liberal democracy was to protect our fundamental legal rights, these days the state seems more concerned with protecting its own power and its own privilege and its own control over you and me.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And Gideon, I've got to put my hand up here and say, when I was in Parliament, even though I had concerns, there were times when I voted for these laws because we were always assured, privately and publicly, this was about national security, it's about stopping terrorism, it was about saving lives, it would never be misused, there was always some, ring fencing around it. All of it was malarkey. All of it was BS. The likes of Brandis, and his metadata, as you talked about. It's a huge problem, but every time we raise this, the other side says, if you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. That's such a false statement.
You've got nothing to fear. Well, look, I remember clear as a bell around September 11, the war on terror. I was a teenager at the time, but I remember those same arguments, and we all fell for it. Oh, look, we have to prevent terrorism. This will only be used. And this is what we call mission creep. When the government and the state gives itself extraordinary powers, they always exceed it. And we hear the same thing every time. Oh, this is only for terrorism or child trafficking or drug dealing. Rubbish. It is always exceeded, always used beyond its remit, because once the government gives itself an extraordinary power, it always wants more. It always wants to use it in ways that we can't envision. What we have to ask ourselves with this sort of stuff is what comes next? What is the next frontier in the invasion of our privacy rights? And in what way will the government spy on us? And indeed, go in for more nefarious things like controlling our spending habits and so on, because with things like central bank digital currencies, that is on the menu too, and that should terrify all of us.
I absolutely agree with you. And here's another thing that terrifies me, is when I go back through the history of the debate about privacy and data privacy in particular, it seems that the hard left, like the Greens, have been so much better on this than the centre-right or centre-left parties. They're always saying you can't trust government, and yet they seem to want a more invasive government. How does that work?
Cory, with respect, I think your talking points are about 10, 20 years old there. I mean, back in the day when the more conservatives were the establishment more so than they are now, and the lefties were typically the ratbags running around at universities, that was true. That was true. But guess what? The hard left has become the establishment, and they have decided they kind of like these powers. Never forget who made us check in like sex offenders every time we went to the pub. Remember we had to do this? Never forget who imposed that terrible tool of segregation on us all, the vaccine passport. And this will really blow your mind, Cory. At the last World Economic Forum gathering in Davos, remember Davos? There was a delegate there who was boasting about the fact that they will have the technology soon to monitor our individual carbon footprints. Now, if you can't see that being abused as a tool of oppression by far-left environmentalists, you have another thing coming. Of course they will, because if anybody has shown themselves more hostile to our individual rights, freedoms and the individual itself, it is the hard left. They will use this worse than the Conservatives ever did. I can tell you that for free.
Yeah, I think you're right, and we are under attack. Our privacy is under attack. Gideon Rozner, you are at the forefront of the resistance in this movement, so thank you for that.